There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently, or Asian people differently, or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
Okay. I get what he's saying. He's saying that racist people do exist, but racist people who are in a position of power don't bring their racism to work. I never knew that. Dave Rubin, a member of the IDW, also known as the intellectual dark web, but more appropriately known as the intellectual dimwits, made an appearance for Oxford Union. And during his speech during this event, he failed to maintain his own lie. What you're about to see is Dave Rubin explain to Oxford staff and students that there is no such thing as systemic racism. He's going to follow that up by giving examples of actual systemic racism. Let's take a look.
Systemic racism, let me just talk about America here, so I'm not going to talk about the UK here. Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently, or Asian people differently, or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
Dave Rubin says that systemic racism does not exist because there are no racist laws in place. Let's look at the definition of systemic racism. Systemic racism is both a theoretical concept and a reality. As a theory, it is premised on the research-supported claim that the United States was funded as a racist society, that racism is thus embedded in all social institutions, structures, and social relations within our society. Rooted in a racist foundation, systemic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying them to people of color. I personally think this definition is kind of stupid because it's absurd to say that white people can't be the victims of systemic racism. That doesn't make sense. They're racist people. And also, it seems that people who mistake race for class, which a lot of dumb people do. According to Dave Rubin, systemic racism is laws. Now, mind you, in that definition, we didn't see the word law, but we did see the word policy. And so while laws are policies, not all policies are necessarily law. Let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. Or let's just stick to Dave Rubin's example of what systemic racism is. Let's move on and see the rest of its explanation on why systemic racism is a myth.
But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently, or Asian people differently, or white people differently, simply doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that we can still do better on certain things. So for example, often black people will be incarcerated longer for simple crimes that if a white person committed won't be. Now that has to do with more with socioeconomic reasoning, which is why I would be for, if you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy.
Did you catch that? He says black people will be incarcerated longer than white people for committing the same or similar crimes, and the reason is socioeconomic. And the reason that is socioeconomic is because black people are being left out of the economy.
There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who...
All right, so let's go back to the beginning. Structural racism doesn't exist, and systemic racism doesn't exist. But there are people of certain races that are being purposely left out of the economy, and they can't participate. And that's the reason that they spend more time in jail for the exact same or similar crimes to their white counterparts. He just explained structural racism.
He beat me senseless. He basically beat me senseless. I mean, it's a violent, it is a violent video on YouTube. He beat me senseless with facts.
Let's move on.
I would be for, if you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy. But it's so funny because this is where the Democrats have sort of owned a lot of the minority communities. And I think Candace Owens and Kanye, believe it or not, are the leaders out. I mean, I really think they are. But if you think about this, if you think about the worst places in the United States for black people to live in terms of economics, in terms of shootings, it's Chicago, it's Ferguson, it's Atlanta. It's these places that have been run by Democrats almost exclusively for 80 years. Yet the Democrats keep saying we're for black people. So it's sort of like saying I'm a progressive, I'm for a progressive. It sounds good.
He's saying that systemic racism doesn't exist at the exact same time that he's saying that black people are left out of the economy because of Democratic policies in Democratic run cities. You see how much of a moron this man is? This is not someone who has the pedigree of an educator that should be speaking in front of Oxford students or staff. It doesn't make any sense. He's not even smart enough to maintain his own lot. Yet another example of systemic racism when he says that the Democrat operated cities where black people live are the reasons why black people are failing. Go back to Dave Rubin's own definition of systemic racism and you see that he just debunked himself like an idiot, and it didn't even take 3 full minutes. You guys call this man an intellectual, and what makes it worse is look at this idiot who's just sitting and nodding his head at everything this guy says. You've got to be kidding me. This man is in an educational environment preaching this absolute garbage, this inconsistent garbage to college students. Think about it. These guys can sit at home and talk to a camera and upload to the internet all day long. But when they come and they have these events on these college campuses, they have these speeches uncontested. They share these ideas uncontested. This is textbook propaganda. Textbook propaganda. That is more than enough reason to protest and say, no, we don't want this guy here. If this guy comes here, make him have an actual legitimate hardball debate. But as you can see, all of these conservative snowflakes are afraid of an actual legitimate debate because it wouldn't take a 6th grader to literally deconstruct all of the nonsense in Dave Rubin's speech.
He basically beat me senseless. I mean, it is a violent video on YouTube. He beat me senseless with facts.
Let's move on.
Candace Owens and Kanye, believe it or not, are the leaders out. I mean, I really think they are. But if you think about this, if you think about the worst places in the United States for black people to live in terms of economics, in terms of shootings, it's Chicago, it's Ferguson, it's Atlanta. It's these places that have been run by Democrats almost exclusively for 80 years. Yet the Democrats keep saying we're for black people.
This guy is completely ignorant, doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. Jesus Christ, get me a debate with this. I'll make him look like a fool and ruin his career in less than a few minutes. He'll do it himself, but you guys will still believe him. But if somebody else does it, it'll be different. Apparently, Dave Rubin never heard of Forbes magazine because according to Forbes and endless other studies, by all means, please look it up, the best economy for African Americans in the United States is Atlanta, Georgia.
He beat me senseless with facts.
As someone who was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, here's something that Dave Rubin doesn't know about the crime rate of Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm glad he actually brought that point up because you hear conservatives say Chicago all the time. And about a dozen other cities have way higher crime rates. Atlanta's population is listed in many places online as about 6.7 million or closing in on 7 million people. The population of Atlanta, Georgia is less than 500,000. I've lived here my entire life. What makes Atlanta the city that anyone knows is the metro Atlanta area, meaning we have what we call downtown, which is actually Fulton County, the actual city of Atlanta, which is surrounded by a cluster of highly populated cities, places like Stone Mountain, Decatur, East Point, College Park, Sandy Springs, Bankhead, Buckhead. Atlanta, Georgia is a collection of highly populated cities. Atlanta, Georgia itself is very, very small, less than 500,000, while the metro Atlanta area around an area we know is 285, which is a perimeter. It's a highway perimeter around the city of Atlanta. You have to add up all of these cities together in the metro Atlanta area before you have a population of about 7 million. Now, here is why that affects the crime rate, because if you get arrested in Alpharetta, which is 40 miles north of the city of Atlanta, if you get arrested in Alpharetta, Alpharetta has a very tiny jail. So when that jail is full, or depending on what side of Alpharetta you get arrested on, they drive you 40 miles south and drop you off in Atlanta. If you get arrested in Dunwoody or Chamblee or Stone Mountain, when they arrest you, those cities I just named don't have jails. So what do? They bring you to DeKalb County, or they bring you to Fulton County Jail. So when you see those numbers being reflected in crime reports, they are taking the population of Atlanta, Georgia, which is inside of the perimeter, and using that for per capita statistics. And again, the city that he listed as the worst is quite literally the best place for black people to live in the United States.
He beat me senseless with facts.
Let's move on.
Democrats keep saying we're for black people. So it's sort of like saying I'm a progressive, I'm for a progressive. It sounds good. Well, I'm for black people. Everyone's for black, unless you're a true racist, you're for black people the same way you should be for everybody else. So they've tricked you into thinking, Chicago, I would guess, someone should check the numbers on this, but I'm going to guess about 50 to 80 people, black people, were shot in Chicago this past weekend. You never hear about that. 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 Because it's mostly black on black crime. Well, if the Democrats are so good at fixing these problems, why is it that in their cities, it's always the worst? And it's because they create these incentives that are actually disincentives. And if you give people things, it becomes very hard to not want those things anymore. And I can give you, I know that anecdotal stuff isn't always the best way, but I can give you one very good example. My sister lives on the Upper West Side of New York City. It's a nice area. She pays a ton to live in a nice area with a doorman building in New York City. A good portion of her building, I think it might be 50%, is rent subsidized, meaning that they're keeping rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities to live there, to live in a very nice area in a very nice building. Now imagine if that was you for a minute, and the guy next to you was paying $3,000 to live in the apartment, and you are paying $400. Would you ever not want that to be? You wouldn't. It's just the truth. And then it gives you a disincentive to make more money, because once you make more money, they're going to take away your benefit. And then what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to leave your nice area, and you're going to have to move 100 blocks north, if not out of the city altogether.
This last example is far more stupid than his previous examples. He's saying rent control. First of all, that's not even how rent control works. Go back to Dave's first statement. There's no law that says that these rent-controlled apartments are only for people of certain ethnicities. He's saying that these other ethnicities, wink, wink, non-white, by law are being forced upon white ethnicities, and they have the benefit of paying a lower rent. That is not how rent-controlled apartments work. That's not even remotely correct. They do have adjustments with rent control. Apparently Dave Rubin doesn't talk to his sister, or maybe he does talk to his sister and his sister doesn't talk to these other ethnicities who live in an apartment to actually find out how the adjustment works.
He beat me senseless with facts.
And to his second point, this is just obviously one of the dumbest statements that you could possibly say. If there's an incentive for you to not make money and still have this nice apartment, then why doesn't his sister just stop making money? Why doesn't his sister just make less money? So that way she can have the same apartment and enjoy all of the benefits that these supposed poor people get. Why doesn't your sister just make more money and move somewhere else? It doesn't make sense. The people who are there, if they make more money, there's an adjustment system for that. So what he said is a complete and total lie. He doesn't understand what it is that he's discussing. And he's sitting, again, as an educator on a college campus, spreading these lies and textbook propaganda and making himself look like a complete fool to anybody besides these dumb students in the room who keep nodding their head. Anybody who's willing to actually do 5 minutes of research and say, this guy is a complete moron.
And you're going to have to move 100 blocks north, if not out of the city altogether. So all of this is exactly where the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't believe these people are evil. I don't believe that the Democrats that put these yes, some of them I think are evil and want to control people, but that's a small sliver. I think the average person who's voting for these policies, they think they're doing the right thing. And this is where I would say watch my interview with Larry Elder, and then especially watch my interview with the great Thomas Sowell, and read every book by Thomas Sowell, and understand that every time they have tried to make things better for specific people, they make it worse for everybody.
So to recap here, remember folks that Dave Rubin says that systemic racism does not exist unless you are a black person who voted for a Democrat, or unless you are a black person who's been charged with a crime, or unless you are a black person in the best economic hub for black people in the United States, or unless you are a white person who's forced to live with, quote, ethnicities, or unless you are a white person in a position of power and you just got off from work. That's Dave Rubin's argument.
But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
All of these IDW people who are supposed to be these debate champions, the overwhelming majority of their material is them making statements uncontested. And then when they do have an interview, it's a softball interview with somebody who probably agrees with them, or they have interviews with each other playing softball. None of these people actually have legitimate hardball debates. And if they do, you can't name more than 2 or 3 of them at max. Let's be completely realistic. The IDW doesn't debate. They run from debates, as we can tell from the 2018 Politicon. And if you think that they don't run from debates, feel free to introduce them to me, and we'll see what happens.
He basically beat me senseless. I mean, it is a violent video on YouTube. He beat me senseless with facts.